Doing a talk today on how to become a mobile app developer. So Christopher, let you jump on in here.
Great, thank you. All right, so this is basically a talk on how to become a mobile app developer, kind of like a how-to guide rather than like, here's the exact technical things that you need to know. But first I want to kind of go over just my background and kind of where I've kind of come from and what I have done. So I went to MIT, I did my bachelor's and master's in computer science there. I then actually went out and worked for Apple Computer for a while in their One Infinite Loop group, worked on some of the stuff that got integrated into the OS. Then I went off and worked on the Java SDK, which is part of JavaSoft and Sun Microsystems. And then I went to another smaller company, AT&T Labs, and actually did some stuff in their research group. And after that point, then I started going into startups, and I've been working for startups for about 20 years. Now, in terms of apps, one of the first ones I actually wrote, it's called Spaceward Ho. It's a game you can find on the iOS App Store. It was on Android until we got pulled recently because of an issue with a library, but it's a whole different talk. But this is my first foray into apps was games, and I've always loved games, and it was an easy way to kind of get something out there. One of the next ones I actually ended up doing was for a company called Handstand. It's a startup company, no longer around, but we actually did one app. You can see on the left-hand side, which is a travel-related app, so it's like a magazine that got delivered monthly. And then on the right was kind of like a reader app, and this basically was meant to be we actually deployed it in some schools in China where it basically had all their textbooks online, and they had very cheap tablets that they're using for all their textbooks. One of the other ones I worked on is called Kaleidoscape. They make a really high-end home theater system, and basically you can put this, if you have like a 10-foot screen and bazillions of speakers, this is one of the home theater systems you want to put in there. So I actually ended up doing kind of their movie store app. So be able to browse all the movies, get the details on the movies, and actually purchase it. Another one I still work on is called Soma FM. It's a radio station. So it's an independent radio station. It's one this is what I listen to during the day when I code is Soma FM. And so they have a Mac app, an iOS app, a TV OS app, and then they also have an Android app, but I don't work on that one. One of the other ones I worked on, there was a company called Misalu, which made this wireless keyboard. It was a MIDI keyboard that you could actually hook up to your iPad or iPhone. And so there's an app that was on that actually helped do kind of like connecting it and moving it to like different MIDI apps, and then doing some of the updates on it. So I wrote the app for them. And currently, I actually work on, at Hydro, we make rowing machines, and I've actually done a ton of stuff for them, but recently I've transitioned into, from the start, running their iOS app development for their companion app, and then after a little while now, I'm actually running both the iOS and Android teams that make the companion apps. But I do a ton of stuff with them, and I've done a bunch of Android development and some of the native stuff that's on the rowing machine itself, because it's basically a big Android tablet that's there. But so I write all the iOS using Swift UI, and we actually did some stuff just in Swift before Swift UI was out. So, like, why this talk? Well, I've had a number of people who've basically been like, I've done some development, or I like development, and I'd like to get a job doing app development, but like going from here to there is a little hard. So this is assuming like you don't already have an iOS or Android developer job. If you do, then you might just be interested in see how this compares to your own story of how you got into it. And it seems that you want one, and then this is really a how-to guide on how to get from where you are into doing mobile development. So most of the time, you go to apply for a job, and they say, all right, so what experience do you have in developing iOS apps? You're like, well, I don't have any. That's why I'm trying to apply for it. So then, well, what do you need to do? Well, you need experience, and so you want to go get a job so you can get the experience doing it. And so it's this whole problem of like, you don't have enough experience to be able to do it, and it's like, how do you get there? And it's been a real problem of, especially people like and you can apply this to other fields too. Like if you're doing development in one area, and you really want to do something else, you can use some of the same stuff I'm talking about from how to get from where you are now to being that kind of developer. So the thing that I actually say for becoming a mobile app developer is actually to go publish your own app. So it's going from not having something to actually having an app published in the App Store that people can go download and see. So part of it is like, well, why do you need to go publish an app? And the biggest one is so you can actually show it off. You can be able to go up to people, they say, oh, what do you do? It's like, oh, here, I actually wrote this app. You can go find it in the iOS App Store, or you can go find it in the Android App Store. And you can show it off to people, and it gives you something actually to talk about. And it's a huge thing from you don't have an app to being able to say, hey, I actually have an app in the App Store. And it's one of the best things you can put on a resume too, is that I've actually shipped an app in the App Store. And I think it's one of the best experiences because in order to ship an app, you actually have to have learned the language to write the app in. You also have to know enough of the frameworks to publish an app. And then you actually have gone through the process of shipping. And the shipping includes stuff from just finishing it so that it's not completely buggy. So actually, that you're able to kind of focus and get an app out there. But then even just if you haven't done it before, the process of actually getting an app and delivering it to either Google or iOS, like it's a nightmare many times of like, oh, I have to set up this, I have to set up this, and then they want this, and you submit it, and like it got rejected. Why did it get rejected? So there's all kinds of stuff. If you have actually done that process, like your experience goes way up, and you can actually have something to talk to people about too. So for your own app, let's talk just a little bit about like what ideas would you have or how would you actually do it. I really recommend that you pick something that you would actually use or something that you've always like wanted on there. And it can also be like a focus if you're a musician on the side, or if you play board games on the side, or if you do games. Find something that's like, oh, I always wish I had like someone for like a board game. It's like I always wish I had to be able to keep score for this game, and I haven't found something that could be able to do that. And if I had that, that would actually be great. But it can be whatever. Like there's someone else I was talking to who is for musicians, and is like, oh man, I wish there was a better way of like when we're doing our sheets and doing gigs, like all the apps there, they just don't do the right thing for how I would want to be able to show the sheet music and be able to swap between like, we're done with the song, show the next one. And that's the perfect thing to do, is to find what's something you're passionate about or something you would really like. And part of why you want to pick something that you're interested in is you'll actually get invested in making it good, and also you'll stick with it. If you pick something like, oh, I should do something that's like this, it'll just become another to-do and something that you'll just kind of put off or won't really finish it. But when it's like, I'm going to use this, and then you can actually start showing it off to your friends, you'll actually get a lot more out of it by doing it that way. Now, in terms of what do you want to pick, you don't want to say like, I'm going to build this massive application that has all these screens. It's like, try to pare it down to like 2 or 3 screens, something small, just so you can follow some of the more agile of like, pick something small and actually get it out there. And then once you've finished that part of it, you can decide, all right, now what are the next features that I want to actually add into it? Or what do I want to be able to add in for this extra one? And you can be able to do that. I see someone else coming in. Maybe not. And you can also decide like after the initial version, sometimes like Google will announce, hey, there's new technology for doing some like AR related work. You're like, oh, that would actually fit in with the app that I've done. By all means, like after you got the first version out there, go start integrating all the newer technologies. That's one of the things that is great about having your own app, is you can just integrate any of the kind of stuff that's on there and be able to show it off. And it also gives you great experience for when you're talking about it. It's like, oh yeah, I know that new one. Matter of fact, my app actually can demonstrate some of that stuff. Now, you might be asking like, okay, so how do I go about designing an app or even figuring out what I'm actually going to do? So and again, this is probably, you want to do this all on your own. Or I mean, if you find someone else you want to work with, that's great. But most of the time, it's harder to find people, especially if you're trying to do this on your own and trying to do it for getting the experience of it. If you try to hire other people to do the work, then you're kind of missing some of the getting the experience part of it. And so some of it, what you need to do is actually figure out when you have the app idea, then you actually need to design, all right, how do I put this together? So this is one of the examples from the Handstand app that I worked on. And I highly recommend, from your app, doing from the initial, like starting at when you launch it, this is what it looks like. And you can do hand drawn for a while of just like, this is what it'll look like, and hand draw it. And then from here, if you tap this button, it'll take you to here. And you can see in kind of this one, it's like, all right, if you tap this button, it takes you down to here. And then if you tap this other thing, it'll take you over here. And it basically gives you the entire flow layout. So for the entire application, it'll be on here, and you can be able to tell, like, what am I actually building and where am I? And it's useful for once you have that, then you can be able to actually use it as a checklist of like, okay, I've done this screen, I've done this part, and it helps you really focus it. There's a couple different ways you can do it. You can either do hand-drawn. There's also a ton of free tools that are out there right now, like Figma. Has anybody actually used Figma before? A couple people. It's what we use at work now for being able to deliver app designs. And another reason for using that is many times, if you're going to apply to a job, a lot of times they're like, what have you done for app management or asset management? Have you gotten some of this stuff? So if you've actually done your own in Figma, you can be able to say, yeah, I've used some of it, so I can be able to talk to how I actually drew some buttons in there or drew some graphics, and then I was able to extract them and actually put them into the app. But hand-drawn is also totally fine. The more important thing is that you don't just like start coding or start putting something together, but you actually have a plan for what you're doing. And this is also something you can use when you're like applying for a job or talking about it, is be able to show like, here's what I went through. I had this initial app design, I built it, and then I had these revisions of it. And part of that is having a story of like, what have you actually done, and be able to have a story that you can talk about. Because when you get into interviews, a lot of times like, what have you done? You're like, I don't know, nothing. It's always hard to, you want to have something you could talk about. And so the more stuff that you've done, the more you can actually just talk about your experience on it. All right, the next part. So you need to learn the language, and you need to learn the frameworks. For languages, I recommend for iOS you learn Swift. It's the current stuff that Apple is putting out most of their stuff on. For Android, I recommend Kotlin. A secondary one, you can go off and learn Objective-C or Java, but almost all the stuff that you'll find if you're actually applying for any jobs are all going to be Swift or Kotlin. And if you don't know those, they'll basically say, hey, sorry, why don't you go learn some of that and come back. So it's kind of a requirement now that you know those if you're applying for the jobs. And then a secondary, like they might say, oh, do you know some Java? And be like, well, I've done a little bit. And if you actually have shipped an app and have done other stuff in whatever primary language it is, then the other ones you usually don't need to know. And like for Objective-C, for the last 3 years at Hydro, we have not done any Objective-C at all. We haven't touched it. We haven't done anything with it. So for newer projects or newer stuff you're working on, like it's not even something you have to learn. But that's more in the case of like, there still are some companies who have like entire code bases in Objective-C. So that might be something like you can say, all right, I'm trying to get a job at this company so I can at least get in and know some of the stuff. So you might want to learn it. But it's also, the new stuff is so much better. So I recommend just going with that. I don't know, has anybody played with Swift or Kotlin on some of their? Okay, so a fair number of people. Yeah, they're both very similar. So if you learn one, it will be easy to be able to apply what you know to the other one. There's just a couple of differences between it, and there's plenty of sites that are like, what are the differences between Swift and Kotlin that you can go find. Like if you really learn one, you're like, okay, I've got enough experience, I want to learn this so I can be this, like if initially you did all Android stuff and then you want to iOS, switch to iOS, you do that too. So for the frameworks, there's basically two main frameworks. On iOS, there's Swift UI, and this is basically how you put together your UI components. They have a whole new method, and there's tons of talks you can go learn about of how do you actually compose it. But it's a way of being able to kind of describe, I have a view, inside this view, I have a button, inside this button, the action that it does is it's going to send a message. And Jetpack Compose is basically the same thing. They call them slightly different, but they're very similar in terms of how you do the design. There used to be, and I'd say the secondary one is worth learning too, which is UIKit, or on Android it's widgets. And that's how they would do their original, like on Android, you used to have a full XML file to describe, how you actually would lay it out, similar to like you're doing HTML, but all their widgets. And then basically, then you'd have matching Java classes or Kotlin classes that would be like the views that go along with that. And some of it's useful to know that, but again, if you're trying to get your very first job, just knowing the basics of it, most of the time will get you enough to be able to where you are. Or if you've shown that you've been able to learn all that stuff on your own, a lot of people are gonna be like, hey, you're a self-starter, you actually learned, you went through this, you'll have no problem picking up this other stuff because it's easy to pick up if you know something else, especially if you've done it on your own. So for conferences, one of the things, I also recommend, like, if you're just trying to decide, like, should I do iOS or Android, whatever phone you have, that's the one you should do, because that's the one you use all the time, that's the one you play with, like, do that one, and if at some point you want to switch for whatever reason, then you can switch. Like, I have an iPhone, but I've done tons of Android development and tons of iPhone development, both of them. But it's easiest if you have the actual phone to then be able to have it around with you and to show it off. And that's one of the things you want to be able to do is, like, at any moment be able to show people like what you've actually done. So to follow along with it, Apple has WWDC, which is their Worldwide Developer Conference. They have it in June or July, I think it's June. And Google I/O is right around the same time, sometimes in May, sometimes in June. And both of those, they're all online now. You can go back and watch tons of the previous videos. I highly recommend, like, if you're trying to get into it, is go through and pick some of the stuff you're interested in. Some of like the new stuff on for Google to have like tons of how to use some of their AI or how to use some of the new voice stuff. It's all in there, and you can learn tons from what's on there. And I just recommend like learning as much as you can, because the more that you actually know about it, the better you are for getting a job. Especially if you can be able to talk about, oh yeah, I saw that, I haven't used it yet, but even if you can just know what it is and have a conversation about it, it helps to level up, what you actually are able to do for, the job, and actually be able to. I think it also, the main one is like, it shows you have an interest enough that you're going beyond your current things that you're working on to show that you're actually trying to pull in more and learn more than just like, oh, I'm just putting in my time. And that helps a lot with like people who are interested in developers who are kind of like self-motivated and self-learning. And I, even now, I still watch a lot of the conferences and go through. There's so much on there you can't actually watch it all. You could, but it's a lot of videos. But if you do, like, I pick out the ones that I'm interested in. Like, all right, here's the ones, and I just start watching them, one a day at lunch until I finish them all. So there's also a ton of different resources where they have either tutorials for how to learn things. One of them is Ray Wenderlich, and it is just fantastic. They have a ton of free tutorials. They also have some paid ones, which I also recommend. I'm not affiliated with them all, but I think they're great from, they have something like, hey, intro to Kotlin, intro to building your first app, that are very well written and very well done. And even now in my current job, many times like, I need to go figure out how to do location services again. And so go back to the Ray Wenderlich site and be like, location services. And it's like, here's a tutorial on Ray, how to do it. And like, oh yes, great. And then you can just look through it. And I use their stuff all the time for whatever we're actually working on. There's also, if you're doing iOS development, Stanford University has their entire first couple of CS classes, the computer science classes, online. And they actually have their whole semester of, we're teaching you how to write an iOS app, and it is by far the best way, if you haven't done anything, just to go watch the videos and be part of the class. It has very good instruction, and it's the college level class that they teach for how to develop apps. But there's plenty of other sites, so you can just go on and look for them. There's probably familiar with Udemy or some of the other ones. Some of those it's hard sometimes to figure out is it actually a good resource, and are they gonna teach you something, or is it more of kind of show, and at the end of it, yes, you've copied code, but you haven't really learned anything. And then you're trying to find stuff that you can actually follow along with and learn. And I really like the Ray Wenderlich stuff. All right, so part of what you want to do is focus on actually shipping your app. So it could be you start on it, but you just want to be laser focused on getting it out there, and then once you've completed it and have released it in the app and you can actually download it, I mean, who knows? Maybe your first app will actually become a huge seller and you make millions of dollars off of it, and then you can come tell me like, hey, I did it. I made a millionaire. I don't have to do anything else now. I don't need a job. That's great. Probably not going to happen, but who knows? But it's very exciting to actually have it out there and then have your friends go actually download it and to try it out. There's something about having out there, that process of it, it's a lot of fun. So we get to first job. All right, so for your first job, it could either be something like at your current job, like your current company that you're working at, or a junior developer. Like, how many people have companies large enough where they actually have like an iOS team? Does anybody have an iOS team on their group? Yeah, so one of the things I found is that a lot of times with those groups, many times you can be able to either get to know them and start talking with them, and then being able to actually say, hey, I wanted to see, with my manager, can I take 1 hour a week and just to work on something, or I'll be on my own time. And this is where you can try to structure it however, but I found a lot of companies are open to doing some of that stuff, especially if you've shown like, hey, here's what I've done, I'd like to do it, I've actually had some experience with it, and you can show them the app that you actually published. That you can actually start going to that, and then when a new position comes open, you'll be one of the first people in line to be like, hey, I'd like to do this, I'd like to work on it. Or many times, I've also found, especially if you're doing, at one role, that opening up a junior developer or opening up, a different part-time developer is also something that many times they're able to do, especially if you're at the company already. It's much easier to say, oh yeah, we could just have you do part-time for this and be able to work with our group on it. So it's a great way that you could do it. So it's like you want to make it known that this is where you want to go, this is where you want to be. So you don't just don't tell anybody about it. It's better to over communicate and tell over and over again, like, hey, I want this, and show them what you've actually done. And then you just figure out which ways you could be able to support them in that. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But even if it doesn't, you might actually meet new people who are there, and then they can tell you about other opportunities, or they can be a recommendation for you at another one. The other one is what if you're doing a junior developer? So what is a junior developer? Usually it's someone who hasn't actually had enough experience building the apps at an actual company. I would say, most junior developers are people who have just either shipped an app by themselves or haven't shipped an app at all and just have learned some of the language and are kind of jumping in for the first time. And then once you've actually worked on a team for about a year or two, you can immediately kind of go up to the senior developer. So kind of what you're looking for is, some company that's making their own app with a small team, or there's plenty of agencies and even some, I can't remember the name of the one that was here over in Franklin. I'll remember it in a little bit. But there's definitely mobile shops that basically do consulting work for larger companies, and they have a ton of developers that are working on things. But it's you'll be on this project for 6 months, and then you'll get moved to a different project and work on something else. And a lot of those many times are open to hey, I'd like to come in and work as a junior on one of these. You can put me on it, and they can find something that isn't mission critical, but also is important for them to work on, and be able to kind of have either a tryout, hey, I'll do 6 months or something. But you should be able to do it. And the main thing is you'll be able to get a lot of experience working on stuff like that, because a lot of times you'll go through, you'll have customer requirements, be able to build the stuff for them. But the thing you really want to look for is dev time on the app. So you're not going in to be a tester. You're not going in to be to help out with automating some of their stuff. It's you actually want to make sure what you're going to do is you're going to help develop the app, because where you want to get to is being a full-time developer. So you want to have experience with that. Otherwise, you're going to have to go find another job where you can get the experience doing it. And the other one is mentoring from senior devs. It's good to if you're at a place asking well, how do the junior and senior people get to talk? Do I have someone assigned to me? Do I have someone I get to work with? Because one of the things I've found is many times there's people who are just learning their own, but they never get that feedback of oh my God, what are you doing here? And I had experience where I was brought in as a consultant, and they had this app, and they're like, can you help fix it? We just have this one thing, it's a app that shows, and we just want to have one. Instead of doing this, we just want to have the players, instead of listed by how they were put it in, actually have them alphabetized. I was like, oh, this should be no problem. And then I went in to look at the code, and it had been a junior developer who had never had any real feedback. And so some of the stuff you're looking at it, you're like, why are you doing this way? So like the code from way up top would reach down through all the levels of the UI and then know that the fifth element here was the player list, and then knew that these objects, that every second object was the name, and that's how it actually just, displaying it. You're like, oh, I don't know if I can change this without really breaking everything because I have no idea what's touching anywhere. But it's the kind of stuff that if you had someone who could just review your work and be like, no, I don't know what you're doing there, but let's try doing it this way. It's very helpful to get that kind of feedback early so you can learn the things where it's like, oh, I shouldn't do it that way. There's better ways of doing it. Like one of the other ones I had when I was mentoring some junior developers, like I usually just say, all right, here's a feature, what's your thoughts on how to do it? It's like, oh, I'm gonna go write this whole thing and do this, implement this whole library. It's like, all right, sounds like a great idea. Do you know that this library already exists as part of the Android code that will actually do all that stuff that you want to do? They're like, no, that's awesome. It's like, yes, why don't you use that one instead of writing your own? But it's that kind of thing that if you don't get the experience from someone just telling you those things and then you actually learning it, it's very hard to, like, when you show off the stuff you've written, many times it's like, you're like, why did you do that? It's like, you just didn't have the feedback. So if you're getting a good job, always look for how you have a really good kind of mentoring program or working with it. So let's say you've tried to do this and you still don't have a job. Really, it's no problem. One of the other things you can do is contract work. And in this kind of contract work, what you're really trading off is you're putting in time to get experience. And your experience of, if you work on apps for other people, you'll have more and more stuff on your resume to be able to show off to people. And at some point, you'll basically have the equivalent of a full developer list, and you should be able to much more easily get jobs at places. You're like, yes, I've worked on these 4 apps. And the other bonus is you get paid too. So you're learning, but you're also getting paid to do some of the learning. So part of it is you're trading off some of your time for the experience of it and getting paid. And instead of charging a really high rate, you could charge a lower rate. One of the things I recommend is basically charging by the hour. How much? This is again like, if you haven't done any experience, just find somebody who would willing to pay you on it, and then say, normally I charge $75 or $100 an hour, but for you, I'm discounting everything right now down to whatever price you actually feel like you could do. Because part of it, you're not necessarily doing it for the money, but you actually want to get paid for some of it. And then don't do billing by like, I build this app and I'll charge you just $500 for it, or I'll build this whole app. Just do it by the hour. It's so hard for app developers, especially if they don't have a full layout or full design and full everything. It's very hard to estimate what they're actually going to build. And most of the times, I've never found in the people that I've worked with that they've had it full out enough that you could actually tell from what the initial design was to what it ended up as. Like, they're usually very different. They'll either cut whole screens or add whole new screens. And so if you're kind of bidding on a project, it's very hard to estimate that kind of stuff. And actually, I did another talk, a whole hour on consulting work and how to do estimations and some of that. If you want, I can send that to you. But the main thing is, do not work for free. There's the people who want you to work for free are usually very hard to work with, and they have no real issue with like, oh, that wasn't it, just change it. It's like, no. If you're going to do work for people, charge something. I don't care what you charge, but have it be something where you feel like I'm not getting taken advantage of, but it also doesn't have to be like I'm getting the premium value. Because remember, part of this is to get your own experience for building the app. And some of it is like, it's hard work to do that stuff, so you actually deserve to be paid. And just don't put up with people who say, oh, can we just do it for free or do it on spec? Or it's like, no, it's totally not worth it, because those people will take advantage of you and won't respect any of the work that you actually do. So just say, no, thank you, go to somewhere else. Or like I had one person one time was like, hey, I have this whole game, I'm gonna build this whole game. I was like, well, what do you think you wanna do, what's your budget on it? I was like, well, I was thinking like $250. I was like, no. He's like, well, I can get someone else to build it for that. I was like, well, then you should. Like, go get them to build it, because I'm not doing that one. And I had that one other time with someone who had a very custom app for medical stuff that they wanted. But I mean, the app was actually a decent idea, but they're like, yeah, I'd probably only pay like $100 for it. I was like, Well, that's probably what you mean. Like if the app was fully built and you bought the app, that's how much you'd pay for it. But I'm not doing the whole development, of the app without any of that kind of stuff for $100. So the other thing is, you don't actually want to charge for your learning. So if someone says, hey, I want to build this, I want to do, graphics in all the kind of like a catalog area, and you haven't done that before, then you say, sure, it'll, figure out about how much it would be, and then you can discount, like if you're reading lots of articles or reading how to do it, then just don't bill for that work, but bill for, some of the work where you actually do the stuff after you've learned how to do it, and then you're actually typing out the code to do it. And because again, the point of this isn't necessarily to make a ton of money, but it's to build up your resume. And so there might end up being a lot of learning time when you're learning new things. But the nice part about that is the more you do it, the less and less there is. And like when I actually did full-time consulting work for quite a few years. And at some point, like when people have the app, you're like, yep, this will take this amount of time. And then it's so easy just to crank through it because it's the same stuff all the time. There's usually not a lot of changes. And so it ends up being you get very good at it. And part of it, is just to keep searching if that's what you really want. At some point you'll be able to find it, and keep working on your own app and your own development so you have something to work on. If you're done with the one, then pick another one and work on that. So some of the time it can actually, it can take a while to find a position, or it can take a while to find the right position for you. And even if you do find one, you might be like there, and I actually recommend for some of the time too, like just if you find a job that gives you the development position, you can go ahead and take it, even if it's only for a year, and then to find something else, and you can see if that's not it, go somewhere else. But just being there a year actually helps quite a bit from when you're actually searching for other positions. Because a lot of times, as I've hired tons of people, and usually what you look for is, what have you actually done? Are there things that you've taken responsibility for and done on your own? And then how are you for learning new things? Because anytime you have any kind of work, mostly what you're doing is learning new things. Like if you're someone who, it's like I don't see any new stuff that you've learned on there, then it's kind of hard. Like, okay, you might be stuck in a rut and not able to do new things. And most of the stuff I've worked on has been, all right, we have this whole new thing that has never been done before because we don't know where it is, and it's new code, and because it's, they just came out with it, so here, go. And you're like, all right, I gotta figure out how it works. I think one of the other things you can do best too is to keep, networking. Like come to places like this, offer to do talks. There's plenty of different places you could do talks, and a lot of it is just meeting people and saying, hey, I'm learning iOS development, I'm working on it, and you can find other people who are interested in it, and then also find other people who might then know, like, oh yeah, I hear so-and-so wants, needs some help, or I know this person has been someone who's been great, you should go talk to them. And at some point you might actually decide that you like contracting, you just want to keep doing it. I've done the consulting work on the side for a while just because it's actually fun to have like some other project that I'm working on that, working with people on it and then getting paid for it. So it ends up being, have some free time. It's like, all right, I'll spend, 10 hours, doing this, a month. And then it ends up being, an additional amount of money. There's also plenty of other places you can go. One of the other meetups, at least for iOS, I recommend is the Nashville Cocoa Heads meetup. They meet once a month, and it's specifically focused on like iOS and Mac development. And there's quite a few people in there who have current jobs at companies doing iOS development. So it's also a good place to meet people, or even get feedback on, hey, I wrote this, or they have a Slack channel, and people all the time there post like, hey, this is what I'm doing. Does anybody have any, could everyone do a code review or give me feedback on this? And so some of the junior people post it there, and some of the people who have done stuff are like, yeah, that makes sense. I have no idea why you're doing this. You might want to try this other thing, but this part looks good. I don't know about that. So it's another great way, and I don't know specifically for the Android ones if there's one as active here, but if it's one you really want, you could be able to just try to find it or ask people, hey, where do you actually find out about it? I know there's some other ones that are just like mobile-only groups that I've been to, but I haven't been to them in a while. And there's plenty of other tech meetups, and you don't have to be ones that are local. You can actually do virtual ones. It's another great way to be able to find ones that are pretty active virtually. Did you want that?
Yes.
Okay. I saw you about to, like, oh, you probably want that one. And then most of it is like, just to keep going on it. Like, don't give up, or don't get just, get put down by either no's or people being negative about it. Because if it's something that you really want, I highly encourage you to keep going for that. And then, like I always say, like, this is not the truth. All the stuff I'm saying is not the truth. It's just my own view of how I've gotten there, and my own experience of, like, having people kind of go through the process. I had one guy, John Saba. Some people might know him from the game developer group, but John Saba, he basically came to the group. He didn't know anything, and he actually taught himself coding, and then he put together a game, and he actually released a game in Python. And then he did the same thing, started learning iOS development. He was going to build a game using the iOS code set, Objective-C. Started teaching himself. I could see that he was doing it. And then at the handstand at the company, I was like, we need to hire someone who is a junior iOS developer. I was like, John, I think you'd be perfect. He's like, I don't know anything about it. I was like, I don't care. Like, I've seen that you know enough that you're very self-taught, you're willing to work and willing to learn, and you at least have known some of it, so you've known some of the tools. I've seen that you've built the apps, you've done some of it, so you know enough of it that I think the rest of it, we'd be like, go learn this, and we're willing to pay you for it, because we need somebody to work for it, and we just need someone now, and I actually know you as a person too, and you're very nice, and I think you'd be great to work with. So I was like, all right, I don't know if I'm gonna do that, and then, so he basically tried it for a little while, and then he went full time, and so I hired him for that. And after that, then he went to, hired by another company doing iOS development, and then went to another company. He worked for Lonely Planet and built some of their apps that was for them. And then I actually hired him again at Hydro to build a Hydro app. So, and that's the other thing I say too, is like, careers are long, jobs are short. So always kind of do really good at your current job, because you never know who you might run into there. And then also, like, this is not the only way to do it. There are plenty of ways to get into it. And so I just recommend, if this doesn't work, maybe you can pick parts of it or find your own way to do it. And it's really just like finding the way that works for you and just keep going on it. And the last thing I was going to share is that my latest project has been, I've taught intro to programming for kids ages 11 to 14 for like the last 20 years during the summer. And so I've just finally put it into book format, and then so I'm just, if anybody is interested in like giving feedback on it, I'm just interested in, hey, here's a thing to teach people basic programming. It's not a CS class, it's more meant to be, do you like programming, yes or no? And this kind of will do, this is a program to basically get you from knowing nothing to actually writing a game and kind of decide, do you actually like it? And this has been my most recent project that I've been working on. So, that's the end of my talk. So I just want to see, like, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff either I said or anything more you want to know about that I didn't cover? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, Kevin Topshine. I'm just wondering, how can you actually steer an interview conversation to what you're capable of versus what they want you to know?
I think it's, for like in the interview, you're asking like, how do I kind of steer it more to this? A lot of times they'll ask you specific questions, and then you can find out, like, either I would, at a point be like, hey, I'd like to, or you can even start it at the very beginning. It's like, hey, when we do this, I'd like to actually just have 5 minutes so I can just tell you about the stuff that I've actually done and kind of what I've been working on. So would you like me to do that at the beginning or in the middle or the end? And kind of just, do it that way, and then be like, oh, why wouldn't you start with that? I mean, most of the times in the interviews, a lot of it, they're gonna be asking you, like, at either a resume or to find out some of the stuff that you have been working on. So, but that's the one way you can actually just kind of interrupt it or be able to say, hey, I'd like to be able to do this. And I think the other thing too is, if companies are interviewing you and they're looking for a very specific thing, there's no way, if they're focused on like, you have to have this skill, you're not in here, then it's very hard to get them out of that. You can try, and you might be able to, but if you don't, then you don't want to work there anyways, because how their stuff is going to be set up is you're going to be very pigeonholed, and they're not going to have flexibility. They won't be really seeing you as someone who can grow. You'll be pigeonholed into one thing. So for those, I was like, take it as a gift that they didn't want you there, because then it would be harder to work with them. But most of the places I've seen where you're doing like good interviews, a lot of times they'll have a time for that anyways. But if not, you could always just say, hey, I'd like to be able to show off what I've done and talk about that kind of stuff. Does that answer for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was always trying to, lately my last 3 interviews, they haven't even looked at my links through LinkedIn, which
Yeah.
amazes me. So like, right at the top, I have my portfolio page and I'll have my GitHub from like projects, commented out, repo, and a website, both so it's easily clickable.
Yeah.
And I've gone to them and they've been like, okay, what do you know in C#? I'm like, nothing.
Yes, exactly. What do you know in C# and can we hire you now?
Yeah, no, since I moved down here, that's it. It's just C# or get out. So
Yeah, I mean, I know there's plenty of other places that have things like that. So I don't know. I would, I'm trying to think of how I would go about it. I'd probably either start asking different recruiters to see who can help you get some of that work, and then finding, because there are some recruiters who are actually, good and can put you in contact with the kind of companies that you want. And I usually, with recruiters, I've done a lot of times like, all right, I'll give you one chance with, a company. If it's like so far off, from like, here's the very specific they want, then I don't want to work with you on stuff. Or then if they have some good reason of like why, it's like, all right, one more chance, but then like we're done. I'm not going to waste my time with that. But I think, the other thing is just, it's a volume thing, so you really have to do a lot of interviews to find, the positions. And so the easier you can have like an initial, like, hey, can we do initial phone screening? Or even asking for, can we do some of this stuff, like a 30-minute, just so I can check to see, like, what do you guys actually want? What are you doing? Kind of interviews. It also helps to kind of weed out the people who, like, you don't want to talk to, and then help you even get a better, foot in of, like, you just had an initial good conversation with the people that you do want to.
Coffee chat.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, hey, I'm interested in this. Can we just have a 15-minute, want to talk to and so a lot of times, the people who are hiring would, they might see the resume, yeah, I'd love to have a 15-minute interview, because then they're not booking an entire thing. They're not wasting their time for a lot of it. It helps them too to be able to sort out, like, are you any good for it? Or a fit. All right, other questions? Yes?
I have 2 questions. One, as far as the idea to ship a simple app just like as quickly as you can, that was pretty exciting to me, and I was just curious, since that's such a specific scope, like really simple app, would Android or iOS be better for that specific, like very simple? And separately,
Well, let me answer that one first.
yeah, sure.
What phone do you have? Do you have one?
I have both, yeah.
Okay, well, if you have both, then it doesn't matter. So you're one of the rare.
More often I use my Apple.
Okay, so then I would do the Apple one. It's because really it's not. It's mostly like the reason to pick the one that you have is because the one is you're most familiar with to be able to make an app that will look like a good app. If you're normally an iOS user but you want to learn Android, when you write an app, you're going to write an app that looks kind of like an iOS app, and people who know Android are going to look at it and be like, dude, why are you putting this here? You don't need a back button. The back button is actually part of the hardware thing. Like, you don't need to put any of that on there. Stop doing UI like that. And so it's that same experience. If you're an Android user and you're building an iOS app and you're not being really focused on it, you might build something that looks totally out of place. So if you build something that you're familiar with, you'll be much more likely to build something that actually looks good just by default because you use so many that are like that.
Okay, then familiar with that. I'm more familiar with iOS, so I think that's the direction I would take from that revision. And then separately, iOS or Android, are either of these doing something neat right now that is making mobile developers like happy?
Happy. I don't know. I mean, there's tons of stuff that they keep releasing, at both of the Google I/O and the Apple. Like, there's new SDKs and some of the new AR related stuff. And Google has a ton of, different, like, they have some of their video where you can kind of do motion capture or kind of like pose displays. Both of them are kind of doing some of that related stuff. So I think there's a ton of stuff that's in there. And then the best is they both keep improving the IDEs for doing the development. So every year, like, they usually get a lot better. Sometimes they're not better enough. You're like, come on, seriously, fix this one. And you fix this issue.
Same thing. So
Yeah.
I have React Native then.
What about React Native?
So I mean, it works on both.
Yeah, my experience, I've done a ton of native for both, and I've done a ton of React Native. So actually at Hydro, the original thing was React Native. My main issue with it is that most of the people who are really into like either iOS or Android developers want to do native stuff. And so if you're doing React Native, most of the time, like the company is doing React Native, if you have a very senior iOS developer or Android developer, they will not want to work on React Native. One, because they don't like a lot of the JavaScript, even if you're using TypeScript or using some of the other stuff, they won't want to work on it just because it's not the language that they really love. And then my other experience with it is a lot of times is it has a nice idea that you could be able to write once and run it everywhere. Most of my experience is it's write once and then fix on every platform multiple times. And then a lot of times in the React Native, if you looked at the code that we had, it'd be like, here's this nice thing, it worked out great. And then you have it if you're on the Android to do this particular part of it because there's a bug that was on part of that library. If you're also on iOS, then do this. And if you're, and so then it ends up being like this huge set of if blocks, and then suddenly you're not really writing one code, you're writing a whole bunch with a bunch of if statements, and then someone changes one because they don't realize it, and now it's broken on the other platform. And they didn't test it because that's not the one that they're testing on. Not that we've had any experience with that. But the other issue that I've had with some of it has been with React Native is that it's great if you're doing a very simple project. Once you get more complex, it can work, but you really need a team who either knows it really well or is dedicated to it. And most of the time I've had, like when I was at Hydro, we had a React Native app, but we're using some Bluetooth libraries, we're using some other libraries that had native Objective-C libraries. And so when I first came, part of my job was actually to go fix the underlying libraries. And if I only knew React Native, I wouldn't have been able to fix that. It's like, you guys really need someone who's a senior iOS developer, can actually fix the lower level libraries there. So I spent a lot of my time fixing the underlying stuff, and someone who has just done React Native would not be able to do that. So then you kind of come to this question, like you need someone who can do React Native and also do some of the platforms. And that's why it's harder, especially if you're just starting, to be able to do all that. So I just say pick one native one and then go with that. Yes?
Yeah, what are all the platforms you use, say in iOS development? Would you you said SwiftUI, do you also use Xcode or anything else?
Yeah, so Xcode is the what you actually use to build the app. So it's kind of the tool that you use to build it. And then you use SwiftUI to build the app. So that's the framework. Is there a framework of like, I want an app, I want a view, I want a button. Those are all things like the framework. And then how you actually write it, like the language that you're writing in is just Swift. So that's kind of like the tool that you're using to write it, the language that you actually see typing in is Swift, and then kind of the components that go around it, that's the SwiftUI. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just making sure, because I just started downloading tutorials today, so I was doing a bunch of downloads on my computer yesterday, so I'm starting building
Yeah.
iOS apps.
Great.
today, and they were talking about using Xcode, and they didn't mention anything about SwiftUI, so I just...
Yeah, they probably will get into it if like tutorial, I don't know if it's if you look at Ray Winderlich, they have some good tutorials of like how to build your first SwiftUI app, or even how to do some of it. And they have some really good stuff in there. If it's not that, it might just be like writing in Swift, and you can do that too. But at some point you'll want to learn how to build your user interface. And that one, everybody is switching to SwiftUI, so it's good to just go ahead and learn that. I think I'll come back to you. Yeah?
Yeah, probably a half dozen times I've delved into I've started doing this. I hate Visual Studio.
Yeah.
I hate Emulator for Android. Is there anything else?
Sadly, no. Well, so in Visual Studio, do you mean the Android Studio?
I don't know.
So probably you can use Visual Studio for some of it, but it's the one that Google deploys now is Android Studio. It's based off the JetBrains from a long time ago. It keeps getting better over the years, but I still find it pretty awful. So no, it hasn't gotten any better. I mean, it's gotten better, but it still has lots of issues. And the emulators have gotten a lot better in the last couple of versions, but there is still issues with them. The one thing you can do is just have a device that you connect to and run it on it.
Okay.
But the last couple of versions, there's one version where they finally fixed a bunch of issues with the emulator that actually got to be a lot faster, and you can do it on there. So you might just want to try it again and see. But then they've added all the new libraries, which then slow it down some. So it's kind of half one, half the other. All right. Yes.
So you talk about React Native. Is Flutter the same issue, or is it a little bit better?
Flutter's the same issue. The other problem that I've had with some of the either React Native or Flutter, especially if you're at a team that's using some more leading edge development, either sometimes there'll be a bug in the Flutter SDK, like we've had it with React Native, where there was an issue where new version of iOS was coming out, and it had an issue that wasn't fixed yet. You couldn't actually build, couldn't do any of this stuff. And so you're kind of stuck, dependent on them to be able to, when you could actually ship the new stuff. The same thing, like they might add some features in there or a new library that you then can't access until someone either writes a library exposing it, you write it yourself. And so it kind of becomes this process of like, if you really need to use some of the newer stuff, a lot of times you're dependent on them to fix it. And we ran into a problem with React Native where, and it's the same thing with like Flutter. I don't know if I think it's better than some of the React Native stuff, but like with React Native, we had an issue where one of the libraries, a third-party library that a lot of people were using, Facebook released a new version of React Native, and like this library didn't work at all. It was totally broken. They're like, that's not our problem. It's not our library. We don't care. And we're like, but everybody, like 40% of the people are using it. If you look at the GitHub issue for it, like there's thousands of people saying fix this. They're like, closed. Not our problem. Not our library. You go fix it. And so we couldn't actually upgrade to that version for like 4 months or so. And so it was like, and some of it were like, all right, we need to figure out how to adjust this and get it off. So, yes.
I'm just, I'm a beginner myself, and I heard what the attendee here mentioned about Xcode. That's for Apple.
Yep.
And I'm on Android.
Yeah. So for the equivalent version on Android, and if you go to Ray Wenderlich, they have some like build your first Android app. So you'll download Android Studio. That's the tool that you're going to use to build everything. Then you're going to write your actual code, like the language will be Kotlin. So you'll type it in Kotlin, and then the framework for how you kind of put all stuff together is called Jetpack Compose. But if you go to like the Ray Wenderlich site is one of the best ones for like, especially for newbies. And it's what I actually used a long time ago when I was trying to learn iOS stuff. I'm like, I need some good ones. I found this one's like, oh, these are so good. So I just remember doing
One
that.
more question.
Okay, one more question.
Oh, yes. What would you suggest if you're wanting to like build an app for like both platforms?
If you what?
If you're wanting to build an app for both platforms.
What do I actually
At
recommend?
once. At once, yeah.
You write it 2 times. And
maybe
my-
like back end, like maybe like same core for like back end, but like for front end 2 times.
Yeah, and even for the back end, you can use some stuff that like generates libraries for you. So if you're using like Open API spec, you can kind of define your API, and then you can generate the lower level library for both platforms, and you can use that. But my experience has been, and because I've done this a lot, either in consulting work or whether I work with somebody else, like it's so much easier to actually to build the app once and get the things right on one platform. And then when you take the second one is like almost twice as fast or even faster, because you already have figured out how do I structure it? What are the problems we're going to run into?
Yeah.
You've already worked out like all the UI issues that you didn't realize until you actually built it. So even at our work, we're building one first until we like, I don't care which one we build it on first, but we're going to build a feature on one first, and then we'll resolve all the issues, and then the other people can actually just look at the code like, yep, I can do all that same stuff. And sometimes you can copy it directly. Like some of the stuff, you can copy all the same enumerations and just change some of the names or change some of it. But it becomes a lot more easy when someone says like, here's how this app works and here's the exact structure of it. You're like, great, I'll just copy it.
Alright.
But and that's how I actually recommend doing it. You build it twice, but you build one first, and the second one goes a lot faster.
All right.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
I think that guy knows a little bit about mobile.